Let's fill the front. I'm gonna stand here. I'm not gonna bite you. Come in, come closer.
All right, so while you guys are doing that, I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Carla Cow. I'm representing the North Oconee River project that I formed with Susie, an organization I formed with Susie Henderson and Eva. She's right here, Eva. And we have two other team members, Berea and Nima, who aren't here. So our story is that last year we found out about the community rights movement, which you're going to learn much more about today. And we were really inspired by the community rights movement's work in helping communities protect themselves and their environment through passing locally enforceable laws. We decided to write a grant, and that was made available to us from the Alliance for the Arts and Research Universities, A2RU, and we received it, luckily. And we also then ended up getting sponsored by Ideas for Creative Exploration, which is an interdisciplinary research initiative at UGA. Mark Callahan is artistic director, and he really helped us out with the grant writing and with just supporting this project in general. We also received support from the Wilson Center A2RU Research Cluster and from Watershed UGA. So, Paul Cienfuegos I discovered online as I was researching community rights movement, and he's a national spokesperson for the movement. He's done a ton of interviews. He travels around the country doing just the type of workshop that you're going to experience today, as well as more extended workshops, weekend workshops. And is there anything else? Oh, right now he's based in Portland, Oregon. And he has his own national organization that he just recently launched, Community Rights US. So he's been here since Sunday evening, and we've been just going around town and meeting lots of really great people. Paul met with some people from the Sustainability Office and Laura German and some of her friends. Where is she? Yeah. So we're really grateful for all the people that we've been able to talk to, and we're really grateful that all of you guys showed up so Paul can give really good, comprehensive, as comprehensive as a 3-hour workshop can be on community rights and how we can apply that principles of that movement to Athens. So just another quick note before we go into this. In terms of our project goal, the North Oconee River project, one of the main reasons we're bringing him down here is because our mission is to push legislation in Athens for rights of nature law, protecting the North Oconee River, and possibly Middle Oconee. We've had people say, why just the North Oconee? Why not expand? So we're already starting to think about things like that. But that's our goal, and it's a pretty big goal, and we're not, we have funding for a year, but the idea is to just recruit, get interest going here, and then try to develop that interest for the long run and pushing legislation. So that's it, and Paul Cienfuegos, you can take it away.
Thank you, Carla. Carla and Susie have just been amazing hosts for the last few days. This is Susie, if you haven't. You want to do this? And Eva I just met. Where's Eva, who's part of the core team as well. So it's been an honor to spend the last couple of days here, and I have a hunch I'll probably be back to continue with their amazing project, long-term project. So as Carla said, my name is Paul Cienfuegos, and I have been a grassroots community organizer and workshop leader for longer than I quite can believe. I went to college in Olympia, Washington from '76 to '81, and within my first or second year in college, I was already becoming a fairly infamous political activist on the college campus, and I spent my first 10 or 15 years doing what I thought were some really critical core issue community organizing work, specifically around protecting ancient forests that were being clear-cut at a phenomenal rate across the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, Canada. I worked on trying to stop a nuclear power plant from being built near the town I was going to college in. I worked on trying to stop a nuclear weapons, a nuclear submarine base, the Trident nuclear submarine base, with a group of radical Catholics and other people doing endless civil disobedience. And I was working on issues that I thought were kind of the fundamental issues of that period in the Pacific Northwest. And sometime around the mid-1990s, I came upon an article by a guy named Richard Grossman. Has anybody heard of that name at all? Or the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, POCLAD. Anybody heard of that? And it was an article printed in a magazine called Earth Island Journal that I was subscribing to at the time. And it asked this really fundamental question, which is, how can it be that we have thousands, literally thousands of single-issue organizations, local, state, regional, national organizations, working on environmental issues and labor rights issues and civil rights and social justice issues, but it doesn't seem like they add up. In other words, if you look at the state of our environment today, right, what's the state of the rise of species extinction? You know, how is our water being more contaminated or less every year? Is our topsoil building or shrinking every year? Back then, we weren't even thinking about the climate, but clearly it was already in crisis, but almost nobody was talking about it. And you could look at almost any issue from social justice or environmental perspective, and what you would immediately notice is that the trajectories, every single one of them were going off the cliff. And yet we had thousands of single-issue groups working incredibly hard. And this group that had written this article that I just happened to bump into from the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy said, what the heck is going on? And is there a structural explanation, or is it really simple? Let's try to understand what's going on. And they came up with two explanations. One would be that we're not working hard enough, that our single-issue groups are simply not working hard enough, that they're not getting enough signatures on petitions, that they're not packing the public hearings, the regulatory hearings with enough people, that our signs are not pretty enough at our marches for the corporate media to give us proper coverage in the mainstream press. In other words, it's our fault, right? If only we were working harder, we'd be winning. But they had a hunch that was not the explanation. And the other explanation they came up with was that there was something structurally wrong with our activism in the United States. And that one was much more interesting for them to really look at. So they started digging. And one of the things they noticed almost immediately was that there was a common factor involved in virtually every issue that people were struggling with. And that was that large corporations had enormous political power. And so they thought, well, that's interesting. Let's start digging into corporate power. And it's not that nobody was thinking about corporate power in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. There was an anti-globalization movement that was building around the global trade treaties at the time, like NAFTA and GATT and the WTO, and more recently the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that probably some of you have heard of. But they were actually trying to figure out, is there something structurally going on around corporate power that makes this activism so ineffective? Sorry, I just keep swerving back and forth. That's what I do. It's what I do. Yeah. And when they started to dig into that, what they discovered is that people's assumption that large corporations are so powerful because they have a lot of money to throw around was actually just a symptom of the problem. That it got a lot deeper and much more interesting than that. That it was actually a structural problem. That large corporations have been winning constitutional rights almost entirely through the United States Supreme Court today for 198 years. 198 years. Since 1819, the US Supreme Court has been granting constitutional rights to business corporations. Well, that was an absolute shock to them when they started to look into that history. And as they started to dig, what they found out is that starting in the year 1819, in a case that involved Dartmouth College, what we now know as Dartmouth University, there was a battle between the New Hampshire state legislature and the trustees of Dartmouth College It's too complicated to go into any detail in a short workshop. But basically what happened was that the US Supreme Court ended up recognizing all sorts of limitations on what state legislatures up until the early 1800s had been assumed allowed to do. That up until the early 1800s, a state legislature from the American Revolution to the early 1800s, a state legislature would charter a business corporation one at a time. A charter is what we now call articles of incorporation. It would set up these extraordinary rules that were prohibitions and requirements that were written right into their defining document, their charter. And that if the investors and the directors that they picked to form the business corporation in any way significantly violated these rules, the charter could be revoked by the state legislature at any time. The assets of the corporations could be seized by the state, and the directors could be put in prison with criminal violations. That the relationship after the American Revolution with the business corporation was that it was our subordinate. It was required to serve us. It was given one specific social need and was required to cause no harm. To cause no harm. Imagine business corporations today not being allowed to cause harm. I mean, that would be like a completely different society, right, than what we're currently familiar with. And so they started just digging, and they're discovering this extraordinary history of corporations winning constitutional rights. And just in a, very briefly, corporations, starting with this Dartmouth College case, started getting access to the US Constitution. The Supreme Court started having cases throughout the 1800s where, in our words, our organizations, our movement's words, the Supreme Court would find corporate rights in the Constitution. And we use that word very specifically because corporations aren't in the Constitution. The word doesn't exist in any of the early revolutionary documents. And so what was going on is that the courts were interpreting the Constitution to recognize that corporations had constitutional rights, which is really a bizarre thing. And so throughout the 1800s, corporations started getting rights that were found in various parts of the Constitution through Supreme Court decisions. And then the late 1800s, starting in 1886, the word person in the amendments to the Constitution started being meant as, the Supreme Court would say, oh, that word means a corporation also. Have you heard of corporate personhood? I'll bet most people have at least heard that phrase. 20 years ago, nobody had even heard of corporate personhood, or even 10 years ago. And so once corporations started getting access to the word person in the amendments to the Constitution, it's all over the amendments. So then corporate lawyers are going through the courts, and they're winning First Amendment free speech rights for corporations. And the corporate lawyers are translating free speech rights into a corporation shall now be allowed to give any amount of money to influence an election, because if they aren't allowed to do that, that would violate their First Amendment free speech rights, believe it or not. So really, money equals speech. It was a 1976 decision of the Supreme Court. Buckley versus Vallejo, and on. Corporations won property rights, and corporations won privacy rights and search and seizure protections. And recently they won religious freedom protections, right? And so it has gotten to the point that it's absolutely insane to imagine a corporation. I mean, if you try to imagine a corporation having, let's use property rights. So a corporation actually is property, if you think about it, right? You can buy a share in a corporation, right? And you now own property. You own intangible property, but you own property. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So now we're giving property rights to property, or we're giving the right to speak to property, right? And it's not even tangible property. So if I said, I'm a judge, and I've decided that this chair is going to have religious freedom, what would you think?
Pretty crazy.
Crazy? I mean, does that make any sense? I'm going to recognize this chair now has the right to speak. But it's even crazier than this, because this is tangible. This chair exists in the material world. But corporations actually don't. If I ask you to take a picture of Monsanto Corporation, you actually can't do that. It doesn't exist in the material world. It is a mind-made thing, right? It's a business structure. You could take a picture of its headquarters, its workers, its fields, its board of directors, its buildings all over the world, but you can't take a picture of Monsanto Corporation because it doesn't actually physically exist. It's a business structure. That's all it is. So it's even weirder than this, right? We're giving First Amendment rights and property rights and search and seizure protections and privacy rights to something that doesn't even exist. And that's even weirder. And so they just kept looking into this history, and they discovered this group, Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. They just discovered this history, and it was like, oh, a giant aha moment for them. And I got involved in this movement in 1995. So I'm now in my 22nd year of doing this work, and it has become my life work. I'm really passionate about it, as Susie and Carla have discovered over the last few days. I'm on fire about it all the time, because I see the community rights movement that is a response to this understanding of why it's so difficult for our activism to be effective, because it's not looking at these structural problems that are below the single issues that I've just become on fire over the last few decades. So I'm going to spend, we're going to spend 2.5 hours together tonight till 9 o'clock. We're going to take a break in the middle. And I'm going to continue talking to you, at you, for another 20 or 30 minutes and tell you some stories about what this movement is about and how it was formed. And we're going to take a 15-minute break. And during the break, I would love it if you would check out this large sheet of paper on the back table, which is a timeline of corporations gaining constitutional rights and people gaining and losing constitutional rights, going back to the beginning of the United States. There's also a bunch of books on the table that are for sale that are core books about this work. There's also some handouts. We made enough for everybody to have one of all 5 or 6 handouts. Did you want to say something?
No, we can have till 9:30 because we just need it
Oh,
by 10.
okay.
So if we want to.
So we can go if they can stay.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay, cool. I'd love to have a full 3 hours. What else? Yeah. So, and then I hope that you come back after the break, because after the break, we're going to spend a good chunk of it looking at what does an actual community rights ordinance look like? How is it structured? And why is it such a powerful tool to challenge corporations harming us? It's new paradigm lawmaking. It's rights-based lawmaking, which is literally an invention of the community rights movement. It's a kind of lawmaking that hasn't existed before in the United States, which makes a lot of us pretty darn excited. So I got involved in this work kind of watching this group, Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, starting in '93, develop this stuff, and I became an early trainer, and I started the first local organization in the United States that does this work, sort of changing what local activism looks like so that it's still about a particular issue that is of concern to you where you live, but it's through the corporate constitutional rights lens, so that we're doing the work differently, even though we're still doing it about the poisoning of a river or a toxic waste incinerator or a clear cut or a GMO field or a big box store or a factory farm, right? But we're actually attacking the problem by looking at the structures of law that allow the corporations to be able to do all of this violence against Mother Nature fully legally. And that's like one of the weirdest parts about all of the harm that happens to the environment, is that almost all of it is fully legal, right? So for example, some of the material that Susie sent me over the last week, there was Pilgrim's Pride, correct, is the company locally, that had dumped 39 million gallons of toxic sewage into the environment between 2010 and 2014, if I'm remembering the data correctly. And an activist group that was concerned about water quality was outraged, and they were trying to get the regulatory agency to stop the corporation from doing this. But they weren't, the activist group wasn't trying to get them to stop dumping toxic sewage sludge. What their outrage was, not sewage sludge, but you know what I mean, sewage from, toxics from factory farms. Their outrage was that their permit, that Pilgrim Pride's permit was being violated, which only allowed approximately 12 million pounds over those 4 years to be dumped in your water supply, in your drinking water supply, right? And that's what happens to us as single-issue activists when we're stuck in a single-issue framework, is that we're not insisting on the right to not be poisoned. We're insisting on the regulatory permit being better enforced. And regulatory permits aren't about preventing corporate harm, they're about regulating corporate harm. They're about how much parts per million can be scientifically shown to be a safe level of dilution into the air, the water, your body, etc. So 12 million gallons of toxics into the water is legal, and I guess that environmental group locally would have been okay if Pilgrim Pride Corporation was only dumping those 12 million, because then their permit would not have been violated, right? So again, there's something wrong here, right, in this story? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story about how the community rights movement starts, which is in 1999, and explain how it has come to be that we have more than 200 communities now in 9 states that have passed locally enforceable laws that no longer allow corporations to harm us. They don't regulate corporate harm. They say, we don't want harmful factory farm in our town or our county, or we don't want a harmful clear cut of old growth forest, or we don't want a harmful big box store because it's going to negatively impact our local economy, right, et cetera, et cetera. It's a completely different kind of organizing around corporate power. So our work starts, the movement's work started in 1999, but I'm going to step back a couple of years because the conversation started in Wells Township, Pennsylvania, which is a tiny little, overwhelmingly Republican family farm community in western Pennsylvania of about 550 people. Tiny little township of a rural Republican farm community. And the economy in that township was family farms growing hogs. And they found out in '96 that they were going to be the recipient of a 15,000 head factory farm of hogs. And they were not excited about this, as you can imagine. And lots of communities have tried to stop factory farms for a whole variety of reasons, from the way that animals are treated, to the stench, to the likelihood that creeks and rivers might be poisoned if there's a leak, property values. There's all sorts of reasons that you might not want 15,000 head factory farm in your town. This community was a bunch of patriotic Republicans who had understood that we the people, we are the sovereign people, and we have the authority to define what we want, that's what we were taught in civics, and that's what the Constitution says. For example, I'll read you the language of your specific state constitution. This is 2 of the 3 paragraphs at the beginning of your state constitution in Georgia, and it's under Section 2, Origin and Structure of Government. And the first paragraph is, and this is similar language in every state constitution, the first paragraph is, all government of right originates with the people, is founded upon their will only, and is instituted solely for the good of the whole. Sounds pretty good. Public officers are the trustees and servants of the people and are at all times amenable to them. the people of this state have the inherent right of regulating their internal government. Government is instituted for the protection, security, and benefit of the people. And at all times, they have the right to alter or reform the same whenever the public good may require it. You, the people of Georgia, have the constitutional power and authority at all times to alter or reform your government whenever the public good may require it. So our argument in this movement is, if the state creates corporations, which is how corporations are still created, they're state created, what is wrong with this story? Why are we, the people, allowing our state governments to create corporations which they then allow to harm us legally through the regulatory permitting process? And so the farmers didn't understand any of this at the time. And in 1996, they tried to figure out, where would you go to say to the Pennsylvania government, we don't want a factory farm of 15,000 hogs in our small town? And they were told, you go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's headquarters in the Capitol. And so they made an appointment with the assistant director of the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. They drove up there, a couple carloads of them, of these farmers. They had an appointment. The guy greets them in his office. Thank you for coming. We are working on a manure management plan for this factory farm application. We would love your input. And the farmers are a little taken aback because they're not really interested in talking about a manure management plan. They want the agriculture department to say no, to deny the application from this large corporation. But that doesn't seem to be the way the system is working, which they only discover in 1996, that's actually not the purpose, the nature of a regulatory agency. And so they go back to Wells Township, Pennsylvania, and they hire a group called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is a mouthful. And that group is a public interest environmental law foundation in rural Pennsylvania. And they hired them and they gave them free legal support for a couple of years battling the regulatory application. And the public interest law firm kept finding faults in the application, which they kept pointing out to the director of the agency. So each time it would come up for another pass for a decision, it was denied as an application because it had faults, it had bits of information missing. And this process went through a couple of years until the law firm finally thought, wait a minute, all we're doing is we're giving free legal advice to the corporate attorneys who are missing a little bit of information in their permit application. And as soon as the application is what's called administratively complete, the permit is approved by the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, that's actually how the system works. That it doesn't really matter whether you pack a public hearing overwhelmingly with opponents of a corporate activity being proposed. That's not how the system works. That once it's administratively complete, all of the signatures are in place, all the side studies have been filed, it tends to be overwhelmingly approved. And so a couple of years of this go by and the farmers can see the writing on the wall. It's coming closer and closer to approval. And they finally said in 1999 to this public interest law firm, we don't understand why we can't say no. Like, why is there nowhere in our government structure in Pennsylvania where we can say no to a harmful corporate activity? In our own town, where we're overwhelmingly opposed to this thing. And the attorneys explained to them that there are these structures of law that are hidden in plain sight. 3 structures of law that have been there for a very long time in the United States. And that those structures of law make it literally illegal for a local government, a city or town or county government, to pass a law that bans a harmful corporate activity. Did you know that? It's illegal for your combined city-county government to pass a law that says no more factory farms, or no more sewage sludge dumping on farmland, or no more big box stores, et cetera, et cetera. No more clear-cut logging. We want to see ecoforestry from this point forward. It's illegal because of structures of law hidden in plain sight. So I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you about these 3 structures of law, and then you will know more than 98% of the United States population, right? And when you understand these structures of law, it starts to make sense as to why single-issue activism isn't very effective, right? Because we're batting at windmills and not understanding that there's these structures that make it inevitable that corporations will harm us. And so if we want business corporations to stop harming us, if we want to be able to exercise our authority as the citizenry to say we don't want this, but we do want that in our future, we need to actually challenge the hidden structures of law that make harm inevitable. So I've just told you about one of the 3, and it's corporate constitutional rights. For 198 years, corporations have been winning constitutional rights of a whole variety, almost entirely through the US Supreme Court. That's the first one that almost nobody knows anything about. In fact, the first time that most Americans heard of corporate personhood was half a dozen years ago when the Supreme Court voted on something called Citizens United. Raise your hand if you've heard of the Citizens United Supreme Court decision. Yeah, right? If I had asked, and I've been doing this for 22 years, so if I'd asked a year before Citizens United, who has heard of corporate personhood or who has heard of corporate constitutional rights, there'd be like 2 hands out of 100, right? So at least we've made it that far, and people assume that that decision was what gave corporations so much political power in elections. But that decision was just the latest expansion of corporations winning First Amendment, free speech, constitutional rights. I call the Citizens United decision the candle on the icing of the cake of corporate First Amendment rights. It's just the latest in like 80 years of the Supreme Court granting First Amendment rights. It's just the latest expansion of corporate rights of First Amendment rights for corporations. The second structure of law hidden in plain sight is called state preemption. And it's really common. How many people, I bet a bunch of you who are activists in your own environmental or other work have hit a point where somebody says to you, your own attorney says, or a local government or state government official says, you can't do that, it's preempted by the state. How many? Raise your hand if you've had that experience. Really, nobody? Nobody? Say briefly what your experience is.
Preempted by the state of Georgia?
Yeah.
Control over local roads where the state controls the road, but the road is in the town and the county. You can't change
A road in the town,
because you have to have their own.
but the state controls the road. Okay. Any other examples? Yeah.
Georgia, about anything significant, firearms, livestock establishments, minimum wages. That's just the 3 that first came on.
Okay. Yeah.
No ordinances regarding.
Right. So you can't pass a local ordinance on those topics preempted by the state. Significant issues, right? In a so-called democratic republic, right? So it's like, again, what's going on here? Well, state preemption says that if the state regulates a corporate activity, a local shall not prohibit that corporate activity. It's really straightforward. If the state regulates factory farming, which it certainly does, my state regulates logging practices. I mean, you've got a lot of forest. I'm guessing that you have the Georgia Department of Forestry. Maybe that's not quite what it's called. Is that true? Right? They make forestry law. They regulate logging. If the state regulates logging by corporations, a local government may not prohibit logging by corporations. It's that simple. State preemption. If the state regulates, a local can't prohibit. And then there's this really obscure one called Dillon's rule. It's the third of the of the structures of law. And it's Dillon''S. And Dillon is John Forrest Dillon. And for those of you writing it down, it's Forrest with 2 R's. There's an interesting page about him on WikiLeaks, on Wikipedia. John Forrest Dillon was a late 1800s state Supreme Court judge in Iowa. And so he was a member of the ruling elite. He's part of the 0.1%. He's a state Supreme Court judge. And so whatever he comes up with as an idea has real weight as a member of the ruling elite. And he started using this idea that he had in his court decisions in the 1870s and 80s. And it came to be known as Dillon's Rule. And Dillon's Rule says that the proper relationship between state government and local government is that of parent to child. That the local government has no inherent authority at all. That it only has the authority granted to it by the state. He says it's a mere subdivision. The local government is a mere subdivision of the state. It doesn't stand in its own integrity, on its own. It's a mere subdivision of some other structure. He says it's a mere tenant of the state. You know what landlord-tenant relationships are like, right? You don't want to be the tenant in that relationship in a conflict. And so what that means, in effect, in terms of municipal authority, is that local governments, town, city, or county governments, can only pass the kinds of laws that they're authorized to pass by the state. So, in a way, state preemption and Dillon's Rule are flip sides of the same coin. State preemption says if the state regulates, you can't ban. And Dillon's Rule says you're only allowed to pass laws we tell you you're allowed to pass. Well, no wonder local government is so powerless with those 3 rules in place. And what's so interesting is that every local elected official on their first day swears an oath of office. It happens in every city, county, in every state. And in their oath of office, they swear to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. There's only one problem. It's illegal for them to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the residents. Because really all that's left for local government to do is they can initiate zoning. They're given authority by the state to zone. But interestingly enough, some state governments are now even taking zoning authority away. And it's either Michigan or Iowa, and I'm forgetting which, just in the last few months, has initiated a process where they're going to take zoning away from counties. Because even that level of self-governance is now a threat to the ruling elite who run the state. And apologies that I can't remember which of those 2 states it is. So those are the 3 structures of law, and the attorneys from this public interest law firm are explaining this in 1999 to these local patriotic Republican hog farmers, family hog farmers, and they're aghast. They didn't understand this. Most people don't understand this. And so they said the farmers said to the attorneys, okay, I mean, this blows our minds, but so you're saying that we can't even write a local law. We can't get our Wells Township supervisors to write a local law that would ban factory farms in our township. And the attorney said, well, we can draft you that law and you can pass it, but the law will be illegal. You'll be passing a law that will likely be challenged by higher authorities because it would violate corporate constitutional rights, state preemption, and Dillon's Rule. But you could do it. And the Wells Township supervisors and farmers had reached the point of so much frustration over these 3 years of trying to stop this thing from coming into their town that they'd reached the point where they were now less afraid of the lawsuit than they were afraid of the factory farm. And that was really the moment that the community rights movement was born in 1999. And 5 I forget if it was either 3 or 5 member township supervisors, but they passed it unanimously. It was called the Anti-Corporate Farming Ordinance, and it banned factory farms in Wells Township. And then everybody waited for the lawsuit, and it didn't come. And that was a shock to everybody. And in fact, what happened was the company that was getting really close to having its application approved by the regulatory agency pulled its permit. And there wasn't a lawsuit. Well, word spread really quickly across rural conservative Pennsylvania because about 10 or 15 or 20, I forget exactly how many, other conservative townships, also farm communities, they were also going to receive factory farms. There was a huge influx from the Deep South of factory farm applications in Pennsylvania. And they all replicated the anti-corporate farming ordinance. So within a year or two, 20 townships had all passed this thing. And there was no lawsuit. They all pulled their applications. Remarkable, not expected. There was a group of dozens and dozens of communities in rural Pennsylvania that had been trying to figure out how to stop urban sewage sludge from being dumped on their farmland in their townships. They came to this public interest law firm and they said, can you help us draft an ordinance that bans that? It was drafted, and dozens of rural Pennsylvania communities banned that, and there was no lawsuit. And then in Maine, in rural Maine, there were a couple of communities that were in the process through the regulatory agency situation, which is what most activists doing environmental activism, we assume that that's where you go. You go to the state or federal regulatory agency that regulates that company impacting the environment in a certain way. And that's what these two communities had been doing in Maine, battling Nestle Corporation that wanted to put water bottling plants into their communities. There were actually 4 working within the regulatory system, and 2 of them decided they were going to see whether this other strategy worked better. And so they contacted this Pennsylvania firm, and they got a draft ordinance written that bans corporations engaging in water withdrawal for bottling. Shapley, Maine was one town, and I'm forgetting the name of the other. And the other 2 communities continued to battle Nestle through the regulatory process. And the 2 that stayed in the regulatory process now have Nestle bottling plants. And the 2 that left and did community rights ordinances stopped the plants. And again, there was no lawsuit. Truly remarkable. And in fact, in Shapley, Nestle Corporation had already put in, I think, if I'm remembering right, $500,000 in infrastructure in the ground illegally without a permit, assuming that they were about to be permitted. And even with that kind of investment already in the ground, they still walked away from Shapley, Maine. Yeah.
Is that because of reputational risks?
That's frequently a lot of it, is that a Walmart, a Nestle, yeah, a consumer-dependent corporation does not want to be seen as being what we would call these days a bad corporate citizen. Yeah, yeah. And so the movement continues like that for another couple of years, and then about 7 years ago, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is the first and only large community in the country that has passed one of our ordinances, one of their city council members discovered they were going to be the recipients of fracking operations all over the city, like in Pittsburgh, in people's backyards, next to historic cemeteries, next to schoolyards. And he was alarmed, and he contacted this movement and got an ordinance written that banned fracking within the city limits of Pittsburgh. And by then, the folks who were drafting these ordinances had learned quite a bit about how these structures of law operate. And so for the first time, the ordinance was much more elaborate and I think really elegant in that it was no longer just a ban, it became a community bill of rights. And so the new structure was the community establishes a new set of community-based rights that it wants to be able to enforce locally. And it's going to then ban corporate activities which are a direct violation of the newly established local Bill of Rights. And so the Pittsburgh Ordinance was called the Right to Water and Self-Government Ordinance. And it also contained a Rights of Nature clause, and it wasn't the first. In fact, about 36 of the 200 communities have included Rights of Nature clauses, which we're going to spend some time talking about shortly, that recognized for the first time in U.S. law at the local level that nature has enforceable rights in a courtroom that can be locally enforced. The right to flourish and evolve is sometimes the language in these ordinances. Imagine giving a river in your local community the right to flourish and evolve. I shouldn't say giving it a right, because I like to think that rivers already have rights, they're just not recognized by Western civilization, right? And so we're actually recognizing rights that really already exist if we were paying attention to what rights are really about. And so this new Community Bill of Rights framework begins about 7 years ago. And just to kind of fast forward and get through this story, what happened ultimately between then and now is that, as I said, 200 communities in 9 states have passed these laws. They have banned fracking and frack wastewater dumping. They've banned what some communities in Maine refer to as unsustainable infrastructure, which is around pipelines and other infrastructure. 4 communities in New Hampshire have banned something they call unsustainable energy to stop a high voltage power line from Quebec that has flooded a valley in Quebec and has destroyed and forced the removal of native villages in Quebec. Unsustainable energy is now banned in 4 New Hampshire communities. What else? There have been some unsuccessful attempts in my state of Oregon. 2 counties have tried to pass the right to a local food system ordinance that would ban GMO agriculture countywide. Those went down to defeat against a massive corporate propaganda campaign of hundreds of thousands of dollars in rural communities. There's a community working on the Oregon coast that is trying to ban a liquefied natural gas pipeline and terminal on the coast. There's a community that's trying to ban oil trains near Portland, 1 county from Portland, and export terminals. And then it's not always environmental. There's a community, and I'm forgetting what state it's in, that's currently considered an ordinance considering a sanctuary from official violation of rights ordinance, a rights-based ordinance reaffirming and securing fundamental civil rights within the city by enacting a community bill of rights that prohibits government profiling, targeting, discrimination, or deportation based solely on perceived or actual immigration status and religious belief. There's also a workers' bill of rights that Spokane, Washington has drafted. The SEIU union has been really active in pushing that forward. It hasn't gone anywhere yet. It's just a draft. But a worker bill of rights that wasn't just about living wages. It was about actually recognizing that working people, while at work, have constitutional rights. They have free speech rights and other rights while at work, which is unheard of for people who are involved in the labor movement, to have those kinds of rights in the United States. How many people are labor movement connected in some way? You're active in a union, or, yeah? What's your experience around labor rights in the workplace?
We just formed a campus workers union. We're a division of the AFL-CIO, the Communication Workers in America. We just got chartered.
Okay, cool. Anybody else? Labor rights as your issue or an issue? So, yeah?
Used to be teachers union.
Teachers union.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary how few rights working people have. And they have almost no rights while they're in their workplace, because it turns out, and I didn't learn this until I got involved in this work, that the Bill of Rights does not protect you while you're at work. Did you know that? If you read the Bill of Rights, it says, government shall not interfere in your ... and then there's a bunch of different rights. It says nothing about your employer. You don't have free speech rights at work. You don't have privacy rights at work, et cetera, right against search and seizure at work. Your Bill of Rights ends at the gate or the door of your workplace. Same if you walk into a corporate shopping mall. You have no free speech rights. Your Bill of Rights protections end when you enter into corporate property. You have direct experience?
My wife got fired from Starbucks
For speaking?
yeah, and acting, yeah.
Right? Her Bill of Rights didn't cover her.
Yeah.
She was inside corporate property. What's that?
JJ Coffee, no Starbucks.
Yeah, we learned the hard way.
We learned the hard way. So that, in a nutshell, is the community rights movement, and it's an absolutely fascinating movement. And I just want to put up a couple of things on the wall to tell you just a tiny bit more about our work, and then I'm going to open it up. Is that right here? Yep, it's just hiding. I'm going to open it up to conversation, and I also want to bring up in just a couple of minutes. I want to bring up Carla to just talk a little bit about their project, and then I want to talk about some of the rights of nature efforts that are going on around the United States in our movement. And I just want to give you a little bit more frame first. Oh, there's a beautiful moon out there. I am a moonaholic.
It's a corporate.
What?
It's a corporate.
It's a corporate moon? No. It is not. Although some of you who are old enough might remember that there was a proposal about 15 years ago to allow satellites to be launched that would have corporate logos in space that you could see from the Earth that would be the size of the moon. I mean, from view, they would view as about the same size as the moon. Does anybody remember this? I am not making this up. I kid you not, that you would look into the starry sky at night and you would see Exxon floating in the darkness.
Instead of angels.
And I'm not making this up, and fortunately, whatever was necessary, I don't know what stopped it, but it was not approved. I'm sure it will be attempted once again as a proposal. But what's really interesting as you learn more and more about corporate rights is when corporate directors want to do something new, they check to see if it's legal. And in a rational world, they go, oh, it's not legal, we won't do it. But in a corporate frame, what they do is, oh, we'll change the law so it's legal. And they work their way through the system, and they change the law, and then they do it. Right? Just as the early emperors and kings did hundreds and hundreds of years ago when they wanted to vacuum out resources from Africa or India or anywhere else in the world. First, they passed a law back in Britain or France or Holland to make it legal under their system of law, so that their raping and pillaging would be legal within their empire structure of law. It's very important to the pillagers that what they're doing is legal. It's a very interesting system that we have. So this is the constitutional structure of the United States. This is not Paul's fantasy. This is actually what's real today constitutionally, not what's real today in our direct experience, right? It's really, this is not our general direct experience as Americans today. But constitutionally, we the people are the sovereign. Sovereign means the authority to rule. We have rights. We the people delegate certain responsibilities to government. Government is accountable to us. It has duties and responsibilities to us. It is our subordinate, or else you wouldn't delegate it responsibilities, right? One of the duties that we the people delegate to state government is the chartering of corporations. Business corporations, with very few exceptions, are chartered by the state. Historically, state legislatures created one uniquely at a time with very strict rules, as I mentioned. These days, it's almost like a rubber stamp process. You go online, you fill out a form, you pay, you're done. You're a corporation. But what people don't realize is that it's still a privilege to incorporate, not a right. Because it's a state creation, and the state can make whatever rules it wants to make in the future to change the existing system. Just like a driver's license is a privilege, not a right. You can't negotiate. You can't negotiate with the state driver's DMV, right? There are rules. You want a driver's license, you follow the rules. Well, it's actually the same for corporations, it just doesn't look like it. It's always been a privilege for a group of investors to come together and create a business corporation or a nonprofit corporation. Corporations are accountable to us. They have duties and responsibilities to us, and historically they had privileges granted to them in their charters. Today they have rights instead of privileges, and that changed in the 1800s. It's been a long time. So this is the structure that we could be insisting on as the sovereign people because it is the constitutional structure. And you heard me describe earlier when I read a brief excerpt from the Georgia state constitution that we the people have the authority to alter or reform our government whenever we deem it necessary. I mean, that's a lot of responsibility. And most of us don't even know it's that we have that authority. This is, I don't know if people can see this in the back. I should make this a lot bigger, but this is where our community rights ordinances are already in the United States. We have local wins in at least one community or county in each of these states. Can you see the states? Yeah? We have active organizing going on in these states and probably others that I'm not aware of. And actually, Oregon just joined this category 2 months ago. I'm very proud to say Lincoln County, Oregon, on the Oregon coast, banned aerial spraying of pesticides on forests and farmland, countywide. In just 2 months ago, it won by 61 votes through the ballot box. It was a big deal. And corporations spent $600,000 to defeat it, which was about $10 per voter in this very rural county to defeat it. And we still won by 61 votes against a storm of propaganda. And then we have a fascinating and sad win and then reversal in New Mexico. So that's kind of the basic. If Carla would come up, wherever you are, and just talk for a few minutes about the work that you are doing, the project that you're doing, how it ties into this work for just a couple minutes.
Yeah, so
and are you going to be properly mic'd? Should I stand really close to you?
Yeah, it's fine.
You should stand here, though. Okay.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, some of you kind of came a little later, so I can restate it. Our mission is to draft legislation that would grant rights to the North Oconee River, at least, and maybe to the Middle Oconee too. We might increase our scope. The right to thrive and to be healthy. There's some of the language that we've seen in other rights of nature laws that have been passed, and we're thinking about incorporating that type of language. In terms of where we are in our process, this workshop is like the biggest first step in our community organizing. And I mean, it's been like 6 months of preparation though, because you all are here for a reason. You heard about it somehow, and some of you we directly spoke to and contacted, and so we're just in the process of getting to know residents, anyone who's interested in participating as a resident, and in addition to environmental organizations who are interested in jumping on board. We got in contact with our Upper Oconee Watershed Network. We've talked to people in the Sustainability Office, River Basin Center at UGA, and we're just, trying to get a hold of whoever is interested in participating in whatever way. We're also trying to expand our team. We have a small team right now. It's really the three of us doing mostly everything. And so just want to throw it out there that if any of you would be interested in volunteering as one of the team members, or at any capacity flexibly, for an event, or just on a part-time basis, then of course please let me know. So in terms of drafting a law, I don't know if Paul, if you want to jump in really quickly. I had actually found out about the community rights movement through a lot of my own research before coming to Paul, and when I heard about it, a lot of communities pass laws through the local ballot way, and I don't know if you want to jump in and just tell them that.
Well, just briefly, about 27-ish states in the United States allow people to pass laws directly through the ballot box. And that started mostly because of the populist movement. That was a mass movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the other states either lost that battle or never had a populist era movement for direct democracy. And your state is one of the states that, at least at the local level, you don't have the ballot.
Right.
So you got to go through your local elected government to pass a community rights ordinance.
Right. So we're trying to, we just recently figured that out, and we're just trying to find out tactic, like a really effective tactic to kind of push this forward in the long run, this type of legislation. We've also initiated conversations with some local legal experts, at least one so far, and the typical response from a lawyer, and even an environmental lawyer, is, well, this law is illegal. As the minute they find out it's illegal, that's it. Close the book, close the door. I'm not going to get involved in it, especially if it's a lawyer, an attorney who's associated with a state agency, state institution, UGA. And actually I heard from someone from Upper Oconee Watershed Network, and I have to verify this, but and maybe someone in here knows, that UGA owns North Oconee River, and there's kind of this battle between
They own the river?
Yeah, well, the North Oconee River is part of UGA property, so their policy would affect the river directly. So, but I have to. So these are all questions that are on the table that we are really actively trying to answer, to put a strategy forward to pushing some legislation that would grant rights to our watersheds. So that's it. And can't believe I forgot this, but A2RU is an interdisciplinary initiative I mentioned earlier. And what's built into our particular project is also an art component. And we're starting to recruit now artists who are interested in collaborating with us. I'm an artist, by the way. I didn't even mention that. I can't believe that. So I'm right now it doesn't feel like it because I'm really doing so much community organizing. But I'm a music composition master's student at UGA. Susie's in ecology. UGA. Eva is an alumna. Is that official term? And she graduated with a media. Where's Eva? Anyways. She disappeared, but her focus is on a documentary film. And Nima, who's another team member, is also a music composition major in University of Iowa, by the way. So we actually have an intercollegiate group. And Berea, who's in textiles, so she researches on sustainable fashion and textiles. So, where our idea is to also get artists who are inspired by the community rights movement and by the paradigm behind the community rights movement, which perceives nature not as property, but as consisting of inherent rights that we want to recognize. And thinking about, what can come of that? What can come of an artist being inspired by such a movement? So next semester would be, ideally, at some point next semester would be an exhibition of some of the artists who we've recruited and who've done some work. So, and if you guys are, consider yourself in that camp or would be interested, you can also talk to me about it. That's the project in a nutshell.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You kept referring to this issue of single issue movements not being effective.
Yes.
It sounded like it was more about strategy than whether it's single or multiple.
Absolutely. You can keep
Multi-purpose, so-
working on your local issue, but through a different strategy.
Okay, but
Yeah.
I'm hearing kind of a single issue movement, and I'm just wondering what are the benefits to maybe dealing with social justice issues and all kinds of other rights within the same effort?
Well, absolutely. I mean,
Does that make it harder to pass, or is it, in terms
it is
of,
harder to pass our ordinances whether it's social justice or environmental or workers' rights, because we're challenging these structures of law that almost all attorneys in the US would say are, quote, settled law, unquote, i.e., even your activist attorneys usually aren't going to touch anything that they consider settled law. It's like, oh, that's, you know, nobody challenges that stuff anymore. It's bedrock. Well, we challenge settled law. And we ask the question, why is it appropriate for a law that was written by somebody who's been dead for a century to be telling us we can't do this thing? Is that really sensible in a so-called democratic republic? Right? So just challenge, and also challenging the notion of a settled law just in terms of this framework, because in this framework, the judicial branch is here as our subordinate. Right? So when the Supreme Court passes, like for example, well, let me read you, let me make this real and read you an actual example. So in Highland Township, Pennsylvania, just a couple of weeks ago, there had been a community rights ordinance passed. It was challenged by Seneca Resources Corporation. They sued the township. A judge heard the lawsuit and overruled the township's ordinance. And in their local newspaper, Bradford, Pennsylvania's local newspaper, the headline read, "Highland Township's Home Rule Charter stripped by court. Highland Township's controversial Home Rule Charter has been stripped of its oil and gas provisions by a federal judge." I'm going to read you a letter to the editor that I wrote a couple weeks ago, which I still haven't heard was published in the paper or not, but it's on our website, communityrights.us, to just show you what the proper relationship might look like between us and the judicial branch. So my letter to the editor reads, in response to that news, "Highland Township's Home Rule Charter that bans corporations from contaminating the public water supply may very well be controversial, according to this newspaper, but what is clearly much more controversial is our government telling we the people that in fact we don't have the constitutional authority to protect our community's health, safety, and welfare, even though the Pennsylvania State Constitution is quite clear about such things, quote, Pennsylvania Constitution, all power is inherent in the people and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their peace, safety, and happiness. For the advancement of these ends, they have at all times an inalienable and indefeasible right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may think proper. When the federal so-called Safe Drinking Water Act legalizes the very corporate activities that are guaranteed to poison local water systems, and when the Pennsylvania Department of so-called Environmental Protection was one of the parties that challenged the township's authority to protect its own water supply, perhaps it's time for the people to fulfill our constitutional authority and duty to alter or reform our government so that common sense can be restored in Pennsylvania. And perhaps the first step in that journey is for Highland Township residents to rise up as one and inform the federal court that they will directly enforce their ordinance through nonviolent direct action if necessary. If State College, Pennsylvania residents can do it, so can you. And what I'm referring to in State College, Pennsylvania, and now more recently in Grant Township, Pennsylvania, is that communities are starting to write into their ordinances the residents' authority to commit nonviolent direct action in order to enforce the ban, even if the courts overrule it. And that the nonviolent direct action by local residents will be considered through the ordinance enforcement. So normally you'd call the police to enforce, but what would it look like for we the people as we start to reimagine who we are as the sovereign? What would our direct enforcement look like? And in Grant Township and in State College, Pennsylvania, they're saying it looks like the local people doing direct action nonviolently as enforcement, as legal enforcement of a ban. And I'm not quite sure that I directly addressed what you said or asked through what I just said, so come back to me.
So the situation in the state of Georgia where passing local ordinances is not, or working through the ballot box or whatever is not possible.
Right.
we've got a situation where we have to work with local government.
Yes,
Which is not easy.
which is not easy.
Many issues.
Anywhere.
Okay, and so the question is, would it be more strategic to go issue by issue, or to kind of bundle issues that get a wider constituency supporting them? I mean, what would be
Well,
the strategy that?
So when you say bundle issues, so are you talking about still a
Multi-issue.
local ordinance?
Yeah, I don't, I mean,
Or like, what are you specifically thinking of?
so we have to work through local government, so what does that look like?
So what we're discovering as I tour around the country and I work a lot in rural Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, in communities that have township and county governments that aren't at all interested in local control. And in fact, they're frequently, the people are in office to make money off of the corporate harm. And in those communities, what they've discovered is they have to throw these people out of those local offices before they can have the proper conversation at City Hall or County Board of Supervisors. And so in township after township across that rural area, the work begins with, let's get somebody who actually we trust, who will support the right of self-government to protect health, safety, and welfare, even if it directly contradicts existing structures of law. Because we can't actually get justice. Our rights are being violated by our own government. And so we have to change who's in local office. And what tends to come out of my weekend trainings is that people come in feeling somewhat hopeless about anything being possible, and they come out thinking, I could run for township supervisor. And it's a really fascinating kind of mind shift that happens over something that's longer than this. Yeah. I mean, that still only partially addresses your question. I'm not sure about the bundling, but what happens is in conventional activism, a group that's trying to get universal health care for everyone, and a group that's trying to get workers' rights, and a group that's trying to stop the toxic waste incinerator that's being proposed in the town, have no capacity to work together. In a community rights framework, we're all working on the same issue, and those problems are just symptoms of the wrong people making the decisions, right? That in all of those cases, I mean, right now, if you look at the healthcare crisis, we have health insurance executives and pharmaceutical executives basically making health policy, right? If you look at the environmental crises, the contamination of the river, you have logging corporation executives and agricultural corporation executives making decisions about what's going to go into the river. And then the agencies respond to the corporate decisions and come up with a legal framework to legally poison the river, right? So in all of these cases, if we start challenging the who's making the decisions issue, I mean, that really is the frame, is who decides, right? In a nutshell, that's our work. Is the right group of people making the decisions in our local community? And once we actually shift it into who's in charge here, we the people of this town, or corporate executives who might live 2,000 miles away, it starts to be something that crosses the political spectrum as a dialogue really successfully. Left and right-wing people generally are in agreement about this sort of thing. They want more local control over things that can harm them. And so you could take issues and bundle them together if you're reframing what the problem is. Yes?
So this is going to be more of a macro versus micro
Okay.
question in terms of what you do. There's a large movement of people that want to act in a macro fashion, pass an amendment that overturns Citizens United as another avenue to try to get this sort of thing done and give local leaders.
The move to amend movement, or is that? I mean, there's a campaign called Move to Amend. I don't know if that's
I think there's
what you're referring to.
There's several that,
Yeah.
and they're advocating various things in this, like, ending unlimited contributions.
Yeah.
Shadow contributions, all that stuff. But in general, it seems like they want to overturn the ability of, the general idea is that returning the ability for corporations to just pump money
Into elections.
political system.
Right, which you can't do if you just overturn Citizens United. That doesn't actually solve the problem, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I think about that, I think about when you talk about draft legislation, the corporation will do the same thing. They have, I always forget the name of it. They have their own organizations they're part of that will draft their legislation.
American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. Yes.
That's the one. And I'm just curious about your opinion on the efficacy of something like an overall macro versus micro in terms of how effective those things can be because of the way that corporations will use the same strategies.
A constitutional amendment versus these local ordinances? Is that what you mean by micro and macro, or
Yeah.
basically?
Working at that large
At that federal level. So the community rights movement also works at that level, but it gets there in a different time frame. So groups like Move to Amend, and there's another group called Speeches for People that comes out of Public Citizen, the organization that Nader founded a whole bunch of years ago. Their basic goal is a constitutional amendment as goal number one. We don't actually believe that you start powerful community organizing where you've built actual political power at the national level. All mass movements start somewhere local, and they build up and up and up from that. So like the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement, literally starts with 6 college students at a university, and it starts building, and then it enters a Quaker church in Pennsylvania, and it builds and builds and builds, and decades later, you've built the political power that's necessary to start changing state or federal constitutional structures. I don't actually think that you can start at the federal level before you've built political power at the local or state level. I think you're going to end up feeling like you're deflated when you get a response of who cares from the federal government because you haven't built pressure. So in the community rights framework, what we do is once enough local communities have passed these ordinances that you notice they're not non-binding resolutions, they're locally enforceable laws, right, that end corporate rights within the framework of that town, or at least around specific issues. And then once enough of those towns and townships and counties have passed an ordinance in that state, we build a state community rights network of those towns and cities. We have 6 active state community rights networks built. Colorado and Pennsylvania are the most active and have gone the furthest. Their primary goal is to tackle the state constitutions and the state corporate codes that make corporate harm inevitable and that make lawsuits against local governments by corporations inevitable, so that those are no longer legal anymore. And then once you build enough state community rights networks, you create a federal community rights network. We've already done that. It's been meeting for more than a year, and it's made up of those 6 state networks, and its goal is federal constitutional change. But you're doing it, you're building up. You're building political people power from the local up, which if you look at history at great social movements, everything starts locally. And you have to build real power. So when you pass a resolution in a town or state, the feds can just ignore it. You haven't built actual power. Does that answer your question, at least from my perspective?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I want to, is there another hand up? I want to just talk briefly about the rights of nature piece, and then we'll take a break, and we'll come back and look at actual ordinances. And I'm cramming a lot of stuff into a short amount of time. So I'm just touching on some issues. Bye. Grab the handouts. They're all free. So I just want to give you a couple of quick examples of what's happened around rights of nature, which is a really core part of the community rights movement. That part of the work started in our movement in 2006 when Tamaqua Borough in, I don't know how you say this word, Schuylkill County in Pennsylvania was the first community rights, first rights of nature clause in a community rights ordinance. And then in November 2010, Pittsburgh became the first major city in the US to recognize rights of nature. In 2008, Ecuador became the first country in the world to recognize rights for nature in its constitution, which was a very big deal. And Bolivia has also done something fairly similar to Ecuador's. It's not as comprehensive. I want to read you a few excerpts from Ecuador's brand new constitution from 2008. It's really cool. The section is called Rights for Nature. Article 1, nature or Pachamama, where life is reproduced or exists, has the right to exist, persist, maintain itself, and regenerate its own vital cycles, structure, functions, and its evolutionary processes. Any person, people, community, or nationality may demand the observance of the rights of the natural environment before public bodies. Article 2, and these are excerpts. Article 2, nature has the right to be completely restored. And Article 4, the introduction of organisms and organic and inorganic material that can alter in a definitive way the national genetic heritage is prohibited. It's pretty fascinating language. In the Spokane Community Bill of Rights, which has not yet passed, there is a clause that says the right to a healthy Spokane River and aquifer, and it reads, the Spokane River, its tributaries, and the Spokane Valley Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer possess inalienable rights to exist and flourish, which shall include the right to sustainable recharge, flows sufficient to protect native fish habitat, and clean water. All residents of Spokane possess fundamental and inalienable rights to sustainably access, use, consume, and preserve water drawn from natural cycles that provide water necessary to sustain life within the city. The city of Spokane and any resident of the city or group of residents have standing to enforce and protect these rights.
Did you say where Spokane is?
Spokane, Washington. I didn't say that? Yeah. Spokane, Washington. Which is not a progressive city, by the way. So it's very interesting that it came out there. So those just a couple of little flavors of rights of nature language in the
How
ordinances.
this happened in Ecuador, so they got a new president who started this movement.
Yeah, and well, no, he didn't start. So that there was a democratic uprising of indigenous people in Ecuador decades ago. They started actually participating in the electoral process en masse, which they had not done either for a long time or ever, I'm not sure. They won a whole bunch of seats in parliament. They got their own guy, and I'm blanking on his name, but somebody here probably knows his name, the president of Ecuador in 2008, not sure. And they had the votes to write a whole new constitution with a lot of indigenous people now in parliament. It then went to the voters and was approved overwhelmingly by the national population. It is now the Constitution of Ecuador. Yeah. The current president of Ecuador is ignoring the rights of nature section of the Constitution. So it's the first serious test of how you deal with a president, and we have not a dissimilar situation here, of how you deal with a president that ignores the law and the Constitution. And so there's big political battles going on right now in Ecuador.
Because of the pressure of the corporation, they elected their president because
Yeah.
they are losing a lot of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Is that President Correa?
Correa. Is that the current or the 2008? 2008, yeah. Rafael, I think, Correa? See. Yeah. So we're going to look at some more rights of nature stuff within actual ordinances and within a Native Nations constitution from Wisconsin, the Ho-Chunk Nation, where I've done some work some years ago after break. And we'll start to actually look at what an ordinance looks like, how it reads. But before we do, I just want to make a couple of quick comments. I want to tell you about some books that are on the table that you can purchase at break or afterwards, after the workshop. If you're interested in what an actual legal brief reads like, if you have an interest in the legal aspect of this work, this is a legal brief written by our movement's attorneys defending Grant Township, Pennsylvania's ordinance. Footnote, historically and legally footnoted. It's very interesting, and unlike most laws, anybody with a high school education can understand every single word in this document. This is not legalese. It's written for the public to really understand it. On community civil disobedience in the name of sustainability, this is kind of our long-term vision and strategy document. If you want to learn what our long-term goals are, it's a little pamphlet. Gaveling down the rabble is stories of how corporations came to claim the Constitution of the United States. It's constitutional history stories, but in story form, not dry. We the People, stories from the community rights movement. These are conversations with local people who were not conventional activists, who got involved for the first time politically in community rights work at the local level, and their stories. This is kind of one of the early Bibles of the work. It's called Defying Corporations, Defining Democracy. It's about 30 short essays about history and strategy of this work. And finally, if you're particularly interested in a labor framework around corporate constitutional rights, this is a photocopy of a pamphlet that's out of print called Building Unions. And this is, again, specifically about corporate constitutional rights versus working people, this pamphlet. So, and there's other things on the table as well. And there is, are we going to pass a hat at some point?
Yeah, we can pass it
when we get back. And one of my goals for the evening is that enough donations come in so that the local river project can own a copy of everything on the table as a resource library for anyone to use in your local community, which is like $100-ish bucks maybe. So if you want to make a contribution at break or afterward, maybe put it on the table if people want to do it at break, then I can, then Carla doesn't have to pay out of her own pocket for books that she wants you to have here in the community for everyone. Anything else before we break for about 15 minutes?
If we want to read more specifically about the rights of nature, which book would you
Oh my gosh, sorry. I don't know why I don't have it here. There's a book called Wild Law. I thought I picked it up off the table. And it's the premier book on rights of nature. Yeah, and it's also on the table. Yeah, it's by a South African attorney about rights of nature under law, wild law. And it's marked down half price, $10.
So, when we talk about ordinance specifically later,
I want to put all these back.
This is a weird question. How are you going to address it? The reason I ask is, I mean, we're a fairly active community, huge range of issues. In fact, we have a lot of redundancy actions. But when we do pass ordinances, and I used to be on the planning commission, and we passed the tree ordinance. My question would be, we get a lot of pushback from the local government. I mean, we get usually so much pushback, that's just kind of where it ends. There's not a lot of things go to the state level. So we didn't get, so what happens, luckily, I know you're familiar with this process, but maybe some people aren't, is whoever that came down from the mayor and commission, I know who decided we needed a tree ordinance. But then there's a committee is formed. Some people from the planning commission, some people from the mayor and commission, and then other stakeholders are identified. Some of those stakeholders were not corporations, but they represent a local business category, for instance, in this case, developers,
Okay.
who are, not, if not completely anti-tree, or certainly weren't pro-tree, right? So, I mean, just from the beginning, where you're trying, people want an ordinance. People want something that protects trees. People want something that, maintain their tree canopy coverage. But there are people on the committee who are just from the get-go are getting, get a lot of pushback. And that's what I think happens more often than not in this community, is things available, which I'm sure you've had experience with.
Just conflicts with.
So I'm just asking if you're going to address that kind of level.
I'm not planning to in such a short workshop.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
But that's what's going to happen. That's the kind of thing that's going to happen with this. I mean,
you will get state pushback too, because the things that
sure.
you're doing in your committees and commissions are all legal at the local level. So you wouldn't get state pushback, I'm guessing. Whereas this is going to confront structures of law at the state and federal level, so you're going to get state and federal pushback. In addition to what you've just described will also be happening, where you'll have conflicts of interest, conflicts of opinion between locals as well. So it's even more complicated.
I'm going to put Dick on the spot because we might not say no.
All right.
No.
So let's take a 15-minute break. Check out the books. So in just a couple minutes, and actually, Carla, could you grab the two ordinances that we're going to talk about, and make sure that everybody has both of those, because we're gonna look at them. So if you don't have one that says, there's one that says ho chunk, handwritten by me at the top. We're going to look at that one together and read parts of it out loud. And there's another one that's a Pittsburgh ordinance, and we're going to read some of that out loud. So if you don't have those, Carla has them both here, and they can get passed around. They're getting passed around. But they were among the things on the table, so you don't need to. If you already took everything, you got it. But we have enough for everybody. There's a couple of just announcement-y things that I want to say first. I think, and Carla's going to say something too. Thank you for signing up on this list when you checked in. I want to tell you just a bit about the organization that we just launched a week, is today? Wednesday. Yeah. 6 days ago. I launched with colleagues back in Portland, Oregon, a national community rights support organization called Community Rights US. That's our logo. This movement started in 1999, and it's never had a national organization to hold the energy of the entire movement. What it has had is a public interest law firm that has been doing it as a law firm, which is not really how you hold you can't have a nonprofit or a law firm kind of as the coordinator of a movement. I mean, we're not even claiming we're coordinators. We're claiming that we want to hold all the information that any local wants to send our way so that you can go to one website and get news and analysis both from movement locals and about the movement in one place. That has never existed. So we're building a national media team of volunteers and paid staff so that you can go on the homepage at Community Rights. By the way, so that's the name, but the website is communityrights.us. Okay? Which there is a black dot which nobody can see, which we need to make white. So the homepage is not a normal nonprofit homepage. It's a news feed. It's kind of like Common Dreams news feed, except it's all about and by community rights people. And that has never existed. We're also building a network of resource people and organizations across the United States so that any group, it's pretty clear that something is going to form in this community with these actually three pretty amazing young women who are going to launch this thing. And I'm guessing that a handful of you are going to be part of this. And there are all sorts of support roles that the movement has not up until now been able to provide to support local groups in all of the kinds of trainings that are required for a local group to thrive, right? In all sorts of ways, both internal conflict resolution and decision-making support and models, and just kind of seeing your work in the larger frame of the arc of nonviolent social change and history and context and all sorts of other pieces. So we're doing that. We're building a national network of resource people and organizations. We're going to be providing next year, for the very first time since 1999's founding, a national training for new workshop leaders. That has never happened before, right? So the movement is growing. It's very exciting. It's the only movement in the United States that is successfully taking on corporate rule from the local up, right? Successfully. There isn't another movement that's doing that in the United States. There's a whole bunch of things that if we can actually get a properly funded national support organization going, we can pull off a lot of stuff that is not being done so far in the United States. And I'm giving you that spiel because we currently have a crowdfunding campaign going with a goal of raising $70,000, which is very ambitious, in about 40 or 45 days. We run until mid-November, which is about 3 more weeks, something like that. And I'm going to pass this around again, and if you would consider making a donation of any size, would you please put a check in this one column that nobody checked? and I will email you and say, here's an easy way for you to do it. It could be $2, it could be $2,000.
May I have your pen?
And we'd be happy with either. But what we're looking for is to build a national network of people who feel like they partially own this thing, right? That this is not a top-down organization. We're trying to build a national community rights support organization that is building out a horizontally linked between all the communities doing this work, a solidarity network, right? So that it's not just a public interest law firm, it's you helping each other to build a network, and we're holding the nest. And we're at about $11,000 or $12,000 at this point of our 70. We have a long way to go. We have no clue whether we're going to get there. We absolutely need everyone in the room to say yes to $2 or $10 or $200 in the next couple days or week. So if you check there, I won't harass you. I'll email you and say, here's an easy way to do it. And just as importantly, if you can then take this campaign, and there's a cool crowdfunding campaign website with the standard 2-minute video to watch at the top. If you can forward that to your social networks, that would be as helpful for us. And say something nice about the workshop if you feel that way, and push it as hard as you can, because this is not another single issue campaign that's trying to get off the ground, right? We actually have, we have a handle on structural change here that we're being successful about already. So any kind of financial support would be amazing. So that's why I'm passing it around again. And if you checked, a lot of you checked, you'd be willing to volunteer. My colleague Eva, who's the co-director, who's not the Eva who's here, will email you about that.
Okay, so Paul and I are kind of sharing this
Yes.
sign-up sheet. And if so Paul, how are we gonna do, who wants to be, should they just check something if they wanna receive things
I
from
think you
us
email
individually?
everybody afterwards and you say,
Right, but
but
so
this is me, this is, older white male guy saying, here's the date for our first organizing meeting. But I'm interrupting.
Right, no, you're not. So basically, we're sharing this sheet, and if anyone does not want to receive any emails from us, we're not going to send too many, but we want to send out emails for the next event to have you guys aware of that. If you do not want to be on the mailing list and you put your name on here on our mailing list, North Oconee River Project mailing list, let me know. We met you all will be. We have a Facebook page, North Oconee River Project, and a newly launched website, and that's all. Eva is, you can give her an applause for that. And that's, is it www.northoconeeriverproject.com, correct? Yeah. So you can visit us on there, and you can just email us directly, northoconeeriverproject@gmail.com, if you would like to volunteer in any way, shape, or form, or if you have any information that you think would be of assistance to us, or if you want to collaborate and you're already involved in the community.
How long will be this project?
Yeah, so that's not decided yet.
Okay.
Although we do, it's going to be a minimum of a year, the 3 of us, 4 people, but we don't want it to be just a year-long project. We're trying to plant seeds, and for a long-term project, because a 1 year is not enough time to push any type of legislation. It's enough time to get people aware of the community rights movement, but it's not enough time to draft anything and to get it passed. But these are the first steps, and we're hoping that this can go on indefinitely until some changes is made.
This is structural change work, right? This is not 3 months, 6 months, and you win. This is much longer work. And in fact, the people that get involved in these campaigns around the United States, they come in with an awareness that we, the people, get to decide what a win looks like. So you might, so for example, in Spokane, Washington, that ran a community bill of rights like 6 or 8 years ago, they got 26, I think, % of the vote after all the city council and all the county board of supervisors and all the businesses came out actively against them publicly. Well, they called that a win because they had changed the conversation going on in Spokane. So people were now talking about the health of the river, the rights of neighborhoods, and other things that were the subject of their ordinance in a whole new way. So they said, okay, 2 years from now, we're going to collect signatures again, we're going to run it again. And their goal the second time was 35 to 40% of the vote, assuming that they still weren't culturally ready to win in Spokane. They got 49.7% of the vote the second time. Most activist groups that run local campaigns, they try once and they're done. But that's not how you win, right? You have to do public and popular education. You have to build a culture shift, a consciousness shift, and then you move the culture. That's what real social change is. You have to move the culture. It's not just shifting one little idea in your head. And so they ran it again 2 years later, which meant they collected 20,000 signatures a third time 2 years later to get it on the ballot. And this time, the powers that be, recognizing that this was a really serious threat, sued to keep it off the ballot. And they're now in a court battle with business associations to get it back on the ballot, right? And so, it's a long time struggle, this work. It's structural change work. So I'm not saying that if you only have 3 months to be involved in this thing, don't do it, but be aware that this is a multiple year process for this city to pass its first community rights ordinance. And that it might very well take running people who are in this room or who are at the weekend workshop that hopefully will come up in the spring to consider running for office and to start changing the public's attitude about who is qualified to be on city council in your city, right? Only people who lead, right? That leaders have to lead. And most leaders in local politics block. They don't take risks. They don't have a spine, right?
I try to say they have to be connected with this special politician from downtown. Every month they have a community meeting with the authorities at Cine. So I try to find out when it's coming so they can come there and we have a project. Of course, they are politicians. I was there and I said, I talk about my rivers. Yes, Luciano, of course. This is my email. Send me an email. I sent 10 emails. Nobody answered. So what I did, I took all the trash from my river and I put the trash in the street. And guess what? Somebody saw that and they sent a truck and they loaded the trash. So you have to act.
So when we think about rights of nature, one of the things that most people don't realize is that in the United States, nature is defined as property in all of our environmental laws. So part of this work, again, is major culture shift, is to get Americans to understand that if nature is defined as property, and property holders, be they person or corporation, can do anything they want on their property with few exceptions, we have an inherent system, an inevitable situation where nature can be destroyed on your property and nothing can be done. Because that's one of the property rights of a human or corporate property owner, is to do anything they want to do on their property. There's some exceptions. There are wetland setback laws and other things. But generally, if you have a forest ecosystem on your property, the state, the local, does not stop you from raising the entire thing because you have property rights, because nature has no rights. So this is a big paradigm shift to imagine that nature is property. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and all the other environmental federal and state laws define nature as property. So we're going to step outside of that paradigm in the community rights movement and imagine something very different. So first I want to have you look at the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania ordinance, which is the only major city that's passed one of these ordinances so far in the United States. Passed 7 years ago unanimously by a 7-member city council, which was very politically diverse. And before we even look at it, it says City of Pittsburgh at the top. People still don't have it? Okay, there's copies on at the back.
Does anybody need one?
So while they're, well, no, we have 40 of them, so there's no question. Yeah, there's a bunch of extras right there.
Someone's got this one. So we need the Pittsburgh one. Anyone need Pittsburgh?
And the other one is Ho-Chunk. We're going to look at both of those in the remaining part of the workshop.
Yeah, you need the Pittsburgh one?
Yeah.
And the Ho-Chunk. So we got extra Ho-Chunk.
If you
Anyone
pick-
want extra Pittsburgh? Yes. What about Ho-Chunk?
Do I hear one for Ho-Chunk?
Yeah, Ho-Chunk one.
If you picked up everything from the table, you have it. Just to let you know that. It's in your stock, it's in your past stack already. If you picked up all the free articles, you have both already.
No.
There's another, yeah, there's one more.
So while we're sorting this out, I just want to say one more thing before we look at the ordinance. And that is that the Pittsburgh City Council, 1 week before before they were going to vote on this is a fracking ban that's called the right, it's referred to as the Right to Water and Self-Government Ordinance. And it recognizes that both the human and the non-human inhabitants of Pittsburgh have the right to water. It's a pretty interesting concept. And a week before the vote, the Pittsburgh City Council was faxed a threat from the law firm of the fracking company that was planning to frack the city. And it said, if you pass this ordinance, we will immediately sue you. Now, it turns out that when corporations threaten a lawsuit of a city or county government, they usually actually aren't planning to sue at all. It turns out that a threat of a lawsuit is usually all that's necessary for a local government to stop it right in their tracks and never pass the thing in the first place. Or if they've already passed it, to take it off their books because they're so terrified of a lawsuit. And what's interesting is that the 200 communities in 9 states that have already passed these ordinances have gone through the necessary culture shift themselves so that they're now less terrified of the lawsuit than they are of losing their quality of life to whatever corporate harm is coming their way. And that's part of the culture shift that we, the people, need to make, and that our governments, our local governments, need to make. Governments are absolutely terrified of being sued. And there's no question that it's a scary thing. It can really challenge the financial stability of a city or county government. But if we, the people, actually are in charge of this thing, then we also need to be hiring people through the election process in local government who have backbone and have our backs. And if we're trying to prohibit rather than regulate corporate harm, some of our communities are going to be sued. I have a colleague who lives in a small town in Wisconsin who is proposing that communities who are doing this organizing all over the country build a network between them where every community formally commits in advance to giving financial support to whichever local government gets sued as a way to just kind of share the pain, which I think is a great idea. And she's going to be writing it up, and it will be on our website
So it's non-conditional?
really
It's
soon.
just, if they get sued, they're willing to pay money to help them?
To help defend a community rights ordinance, specifically a community rights ordinance that has been passed. Yeah, and I haven't seen the proposal. I've seen like a 1-paragraph brief explanation of it. Yeah, so here is the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania ordinance. If you look at different community rights ordinances on different issues, what you'll quickly notice is that they're almost identical in a whole variety of ways. Clearly, the issue might be different. The Bill of Rights might have some significant differences. This early whereas statement section might have some significant differences, but overwhelmingly, it's 80% identical, each one. Let me just find something that I thought I had in my hand and I don't. Well, I'll just give up on looking for that, I guess. So I'm gonna run through it really quickly as an overview, and obviously you're gonna keep it if you want it, and give it a really thorough read when you have time later. The first, what is here as section 3, findings and purpose, The whereas section, this is the one section of a community rights ordinance where you can say the wildest and most revolutionary things and not be fearful of being sued. This is kind of your values statement. This is the rationale for why you're passing the ordinance, why this is important to do. And let's just start with this fellow right here, and let's just go a paragraph at a time and read the whereas section.
Whereas the City Council of Pittsburgh finds that the commercial extraction of natural gas in the urban environment of Pittsburgh poses a significant threat to the health, safety, and welfare of residents and neighborhoods within the city, and
whereas the City Council finds...
Speak a little louder, everybody, if you can.
Whereas the City Council finds that widespread environmental and human health impacts have resulted from commercial gas extraction in other areas, and
whereas the City Council finds that regulating the activity of commercial gas extraction automatically means allowing commercial gas extraction to occur within the city, thus allowing the deposition of toxins into the air, soil, water, environment, and bodies of residents within our city.
Whereas the City Council finds that meaningful regulatory limitations and prohibitions concerning natural gas extraction, along with zoning and land use provisions, are barred because they conflict with the certain legal powers claimed by resource extraction corporations. And
whereas the City Council recognizes that environmental and economic sustainability cannot be achieved if the rights of municipal majorities are routinely overridden by corporate minorities claiming certain legal powers, and
whereas the City Council believes that the protections of residents, neighborhoods, and the natural environment constitute the highest and the best use of the tallest power that this municipality possesses, and
whereas the City Council believes that local legislation that embodies the interest of the community is mandated by the doctrine of the consent of the governed and the right to local community self-government.
Therefore, the City Council hereby adopts this ordinance, which bans commercial extraction of natural gas within the City of Pittsburgh, creates a Bill of Rights for the residents and communities of the city, and removes certain legal powers from gas extraction corporations operating within the City of Pittsburgh.
So that's like the value statement. That's right for this Pittsburgh ordinance, which this is a really unusual one in that the process was led by the City Council. That usually is not what happens. It usually is led by a local citizens group that then has to convince the City Council, or runs it as a ballot initiative and bypasses city or county government. And then the next section, notice that Section 4 and Section 5 have titles called Statements of Law, and then they have different subtitles. Section 4 is Rights of Pittsburgh Residents and the Natural Environment, and Section 5 is Prohibitions and Corporate Legal Privileges. And that's the piece I was talking about, is that you write a Bill of Rights for your community, a community Bill of Rights, and then you ban specific harmful corporate activities that would violate your newly established, locally enforceable Bill of Rights. So that's what ties these two together. So their Bill of Rights includes right to water, rights of natural communities, right to self-government, people as sovereign. Let's read the first, let's see. Let's read all four. They all have some real deep meaning that I think is worth sharing. So let's just continue with the reading. 4.1.
All residents, natural species, and ecosystems benefit from possess a fundamental and inalienable right to sustainably access, consume, and preserve water drawn from natural water cycles that provide water necessary to sustain life within the city.
So notice, hold on just a sec. So notice what that said. So residents, including non-human residents, possess a fundamental right to sustainable access of water. So all the creatures living in Pittsburgh, okay? That's what that says. That's pretty rare for law in the United States. Okay, 4.2.
Natural communities and ecosystems, including but not limited to wetlands, streams, rivers, aquifers, and other water systems, possess inalienable and fundamental rights to exist and flourish within the city of Pittsburgh. Residents of the city shall possess legal standing to enforce those rights on behalf of those natural communities and ecosystems.
Right to self-government. All residents of Pittsburgh possess the fundamental and inalienable right to a form of governance where they live, which recognizes that all power is inherent in the people, that all free governments are founded on the people's authority and consent, and that corporate entities and their directors and managers shall not enjoy special privileges or powers under the law which make community majorities subordinate to them.
And that's cultural background normal, is that community majorities are subordinate to what corporate directors want. Because corporations possess constitutional rights, and because the state preempts locals from protecting our health and welfare, because the state has basically become in service to business corporations over us. Yeah.
People as sovereign. The city of Pittsburgh shall be the governing authority responsible to and governed by the residents of the city. Use of the city of Pittsburgh Municipal Corporation by the sovereign people of the city to make law shall not be construed to limit or surrender the sovereign authority or immunities of the people to municipal corporation that is subordinate to them in all respects at all times. The people at all times enjoy and retain an inalienable and indefeasible right to self-governance in the community where they reside.
So this one's a little confusing. Anybody want to tackle in a nutshell what that means so people understand it? Anybody want to try? No brave souls in the room. So, and basically in a nutshell, it says that we, the people, stand separately from our municipal government, which is a corporation also, a municipal corporation. That's what municipal governments are. That's what county governments are. They're local corporations. That's how they're structured. That we have authority inherently as the people, and we also have the authority to use our municipal government corporation to move forward our agenda. That we have rights in both capacities.
So it's kind of reinforcing
exactly
the chart.
That our local government is our servant.
I have a question. You just said that local government municipalities are also corporations. What keeps corporations from doing exactly this? Making their own Bill of Rights?
They're not business corporations packed with corporate constitutional rights.
Gotcha.
Municipal corporations have almost no authority. They're defined that way.
Okay.
Business corporations are packed with legal constitutional authority.
Okay.
Yeah. And what's interesting that you brought up that we talk a lot about in the weekend training is those who are in charge have defining authority. And if you went to an encyclopedia from the 1790s and you looked up the word corporation, the actual definition of corporation in the 1790s, defined by those in power at the time, right? The cultural normal definition is a corporation is subordinate, it has duties and responsibilities, it has a charter of limited lifespan, its charter can be revoked for the following reasons, it has these requirements and prohibitions. If you looked up the word corporation in encyclopedia today, you would get a completely different definition. They're both official definitions. They're different because a different cultural norm has been established and different people are now in charge of defining authority. So our work is to figure out how to get back here so that we can exercise our defining authority over our business corporations, to literally define them again, which is what used to happen after the American Revolution, right? It's not a pipe dream. It was actually our first 50 or so years in the United States. And, and let me say, it's like We the People, of course, was this tiny, tiny nugget of who We the People is today, right? I don't want to make it sound like it's some utopian, atmosphere after the American Revolution. We're talking about white propertied men were We the People, a couple percent of us, right? And black people had no rights and were legally defined as property, and Native people had no rights and were defined in a different way, almost like an extension of the wild nature. right, that white people were terrified of, and other categories had other legal definitions, right? So I mean, this revolution is taking place on top of genocide, right? And yet, it was still, believe it or not, a big step forward from the king is sovereign, right? To move from the king is sovereign and has the only defining authority, the authority to rule, to a group of about 5% or so of human beings in the United States have authority, to more and more people exercising their authority through social movements and becoming persons under law, right? So there's this very long, complicated historical process to get us where we are. Yeah. Let's jump down to just a couple of the items in section 5, prohibitions. Let's do 2, 3, and 4. Let's read 2, 3, and 4 and continue wherever we left off. And then we're going to jump to the other document.
Corporations in violation of the prohibition against natural gas extraction or seeking to engage in natural gas extraction shall not have the rights of persons afforded by the United States and Pennsylvania constitutions, nor shall those corporations be afforded the protections of the Commerce or Contracts clauses within the U.S. Constitution or corresponding sections of the Pennsylvania Constitution. Corporations, for purpose of this ordinance, shall include any corporation, limited partnership, limited liability partnership, business trust, or limited liability company organized under the laws of any state of the United States or under the laws of any country, and any other business entity that possesses state-conferred limited liability attributes for its owners, directors, officers, and or managers.
So this is where they're tackling the corporate constitutional rights piece, right? That you're not going to get those protections through the Constitution within this ordinance, right? That those rights and protections are stripped within the municipal boundary of Pittsburgh. Which again, right? Nobody's done this before the community rights movement. It's paradigm shift lawmaking. Section 5.3.
Corporations engaged in the extraction of natural gas shall not possess the authority or power to enforce the state or federal preemptive law against the people of the city of Pittsburgh, or to challenge or overturn municipal ordinances adopted by the city council.
So there you have the state preemption and Dillon's rule part, right? Is that business corporations that are engaged in natural gas extraction no longer have authority to access those two structures of law within the city of Pittsburgh. And then lastly, 5.4.
No permit, license, privilege, or charter issued by any state or federal agency, commission, or board to any person or corporation operating under a state charter, or any director, officer, owner, or manager of a corporation operating under a state charter which would violate the prohibitions of this ordinance or deprive any city residents, natural community, or ecosystem of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured by this ordinance, the Pennsylvania Constitution, the United States Constitution, or other laws shall be deemed valid within the city of Pittsburgh.
So Corporation X might have a charter that says they can frack any way they want to, not within the city of Pittsburgh. Right. Now, this is the clause where a lot of communities have built-in language around nullifying global trade treaties and their enforcement within a city or county. And it's actually just a couple of extra phrases in that section, because increasingly the Trans-Pacific Partnership, World Trade Organization, etc., the TIPS, T-I-P-S, somebody here might remember what that stands for. It's another trade treaty that most of us know almost nothing about. It's been negotiated in secret. All of these trade treaties internationally they nullify a state or federal government's authority, and TPP includes local authority over their own laws, and says that these global trade tribunals can overrule any level of government in any country when corporate rights are being violated. They're really scary. And there is an anti-corporate globalization movement that's quite advanced in the United States, which has not really been that effective. It's been able to kind of slow the growth of these treaties. But this is another way to tackle it, is to nullify the access of the global trade rights within a local ordinance. And again, how effective is it there? Well, it's as effective as the people of the city make it, right? In other words, if the World Trade Organization's Trade Tribunal says you can't stop Corporation X from poisoning the North Oconee River because that violates some foreign corporation's rights internationally, but you've nullified that authority internationally, how are you going to enforce it? Well, chances are your local police force is not going to enforce it. Chances are the people of Athens, Georgia are going to have to come up with their own enforcement, which, like the communities I mentioned earlier, might look like nonviolent direct action as enforcement built right into the ordinance, right? So that the International Trade Tribunal may have decided that you are required to take this corporate activity in your city, that you, the people of this city, have no authority, but that doesn't stop you from exercising your sovereign authority in creative ways built right into your ordinance, which is a huge stretch. Again, none of this is easy, but communities are starting to do this, right? State College, Pennsylvania, Grant Township, Pennsylvania, Lincoln County, Oregon, the one that just passed there about pesticides, and a few others have built into their ordinances language about nonviolent direct action by residents as legal enforcement.
Can you give one example of nonviolent direct action that's happened or gotten close to happening?
The one that's gotten close is too long to tell in the remaining time, but it's State College, Pennsylvania, and it's basically residents acting to prepare to do nonviolent direct action to stop a corporate pipeline under their town. And they didn't actually get it stopped until they called Occupy Wall Street and Greenpeace National and asked for trainers to come to State College, Pennsylvania, to help the citizens, not the radical activists, but the citizens of State College to understand how to do nonviolent direct action. And the powers that be blinked at the point that these people were going to come and train local residents. It's a much longer story than I have time to, but there is in a nutshell.
Sit-ins and like blocking.
You tell me. It's up to the community in democratic conversation. In fact, if we look, let's read a paragraph I wasn't going to have us read that gives you a little bit more sense of that. Let's look at section 8.1, and that'll be the last paragraph we read in this ordinance. And then we'll go to the Ho-Chunk one. Yeah.
The foundation for the making and adoption of this law is the people's fundamental and inalienable right to govern themselves and thereby secure their rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Any attempts to use other units and levels of government to preempt, amend, alter, or overturn this ordinance or parts of this ordinance shall require the City Council to hold public meetings that explore the adoption of other measures that expand local control and the ability of residents to protect their fundamental and inalienable right to self-government. Such consideration may include actions to separate the municipality from the other levels of government used to preempt, amend, alter, or overturn the provisions of this ordinance or other levels of government used to intimidate the people of the city of Pittsburgh or their elected officials.
So this was written and passed 7 years ago, and the ones that have been passed in the last year or two are expansive beyond that. They're now talking about nonviolent direct action. It's one of the things I really love about this is that every time a new one gets passed, the community tends to have an idea about how to push these boundaries of kind of our own colonized minds and what we think is even allowed, right? We have to get past what we think we can get away with and start paying more attention to what we want and what we think we have a right to in our own communities, right? What do we want Athens, Georgia to look like in 3 generations? And what would it look like if we start exercising our authority to create that, rather than let's stop the latest corporate harm, right? Rather than being reactive, rather than emergency response mode, right? Being proactive. What do we want? Not just what we can get, not just what we're trying to stop, right? And that's the culture shift work, and it's huge. And so one of the things that we're doing in Community Rights US that I didn't mention is my co-director Eva Hamilton and I we're conceptualizing over the next few months a brand new weekend intensive called Becoming We the People, which would be what you take after you take the weekend training to learn how to do this work, right? And Becoming We the People is literally, wow, getting from, wow, this is a really exciting, cool idea, to have this kind of power as something in here, to how do we actually embody it in our day-to-day lives? How does it become a fully embodied understanding that we, the people, are the sovereign, have self-governing authority, have authority over all levels of government, all business corporations operating where we live? What does that actually look like? How does it change the nature of our interactions with our institutions and with other people?
I was going to say, a lot of our environmental regulation and monitoring is left up to the government, and sometimes they don't even have, I guess, enough human resources to really do an adequate job. And I know that there are already organizations like Riverkeeper Alliance, I believe it's called, it's started in the Hudson River, and they do monitoring, so it's like people, citizens trying to do something that maybe the government wasn't originally able, or wasn't taking the action on doing. And I know that they have a river keeper, an Altamaha river keeper, and the Oconee eventually flows into the Altamaha, which goes out to the Atlantic. And we don't have an Oconee river keeper. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. We have a Upper Oconee watershed network, and they do monitoring regularly, but we don't have the same. With the river keepers, they actually have like a boat that monitors the rivers, and they obviously can't cover all those miles of river. So it almost makes you think, like, how can the people also not only govern themselves, but also be more in control of what's actually in the river, and like how is it changing? Because I think local organizations like UOM, like we have here, they're a big piece of that, but they need more help in that. I think the university has a lot of resources that sometimes we don't always like connect with the university is doing with. So that's just kind of like, you're talking about, like, what does it look like when the people take control? And I think it's like less just wondering what the problem is and just like assuming that, oh, it's polluted, we can't do anything about it, to actually we have a lot of power. There's a lot of people who do research here who are just people who live in Athens. It's like, how could you use that to your advantage as a community, so that you really are identifying where the issues are and where best target policy.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I frequently have people say, well, we've been begging our city council to hold a town hall meeting on this critical issue in our community, and they won't do it. And so it hasn't happened. And I'm like, you're a citizen, hold a town hall meeting, right? And tell the city council they better show up or it's time for them to go, right? You are the people, right? You have ultimate governing authority, right? If you think about the right verb, like what we're used to is we plead with our elected officials. Sometimes the more radical among us say we make demands of our officials. But if you think about it, making demands is still from a place of subordination. You don't need to demand of your subordinates, right? You make demands if you're the more radical edge of a subordinate people, right? The rest of us are pleading with or begging our government to pay attention. And maybe the Earth First edge or something is demanding, but we're all looking up at the deciders, right? And the only word that I've been able to come up with is instructing. What do sovereign people do with their government? What's a verb that better matches this relationship? And please come up with other words beyond what I've been able to, but the only one I've come up with is we instruct our leaders. And that doesn't feel normal, does it? Doesn't that feel weird? We instruct our city council. We instruct our governor. We instruct our federal senators. They're accountable to us with duties and responsibilities to us. They are our subordinates. How do we embody that? That's a big piece of the work. It's not just the ordinance work. It's we change our own ideas in our own heads, and we start to think differently and act differently. Yeah? So quiet, you're so quiet. So let's shift. So that's just like a really brief overview. Please take the time to read the whole thing. Let's look at the Ho-Chunk Native Nation in Wisconsin, which amended their constitution, their Native Nations Constitution. A couple of years ago, 2015, I led a weekend training in one of the Ho-Chunk Nations communities. And after the weekend, with both Native and Native folks and Native allies, non-Native allies, they then talked to community rights attorneys, and with their help, they created a new section called Rights of Nature. The Ho-Chunk didn't have a Rights of Nature section in their own Native Nation Constitution. So let's read a little bit of that together, and then we're pretty much out of time other than talking quickly about next steps. And let's start with the last two whereases on the first page. So wherever we are in the reading group, the last two.
Whereas the nation has a desire to protect the environment and the rights of nature from commercial activities that pollute the environment, which has caused climate a loss of natural resources necessary for continued survival.
Whereas the nation wants to provide constitutional rights to protect the rights of nature and add a provision to the Constitution under the Bill of Rights as follows.
Section 2, Rights of Nature. A, the Ho-Chunk Nation, in exercising its powers of self-government, shall 1. Respect the rights of nature, life cycles, structures, functions, or protect.
There's some typos, aren't there? There's the second one.
Are protecting the rights of all living plants, animals, and the environment in which all living entities and organisms reside, protect maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions.
All Ho-Chunk people can call upon elected and appointed officials to enforce the rights of nature under the following principles. Should I read more?
Keep going, sure.
Okay. 1. Nature has a right to be restored. This restoration shall be separate and apart from the obligation of the nation and natural persons or legal entities to compensate individuals and communities that depend on affected natural systems. I don't know if we should go next. Where are we?
I.
Yeah, do you want me to continue? Or?
Anybody.
Okay.
Doesn't matter to me.
Someone else take that.
In those cases of severe or permanent environmental impact, including those caused by exploitation of non-renewable natural resources, the nation shall establish the most effective mechanisms to achieve their restoration and shall adopt adequate measures to eliminate or mitigate harmful environmental consequences.
The nation shall apply preventive and restrictive measures on activities that might lead to the extinction of species, the destruction of ecosystems, and the permanent alteration of natural cycles.
The introduction of organism and organic an inorganic material that might definitely alter the nation's genetic assets is forbidden.
Persons, communities, and the people shall have the right to benefit from the environment and the natural wealth, enabling them to enjoy the good way of living.
I'm going to jump back to IV.
That was IV, so V is next.
V.
And then we'll skip over.
The nation shall give incentives to natural persons and legal entities and to communities to protect nature and to promote respect for all elements comprising an ecosystem.
And then I think we just heard VI partially. Whatever you want to do.
Yeah, which one are we at now?
VI we heard partial and then we went backwards, so we're kind of, I was going to have us go as far as VIII. We were going to stop there. So however we want to go, just read a few more and we'll call it a night.
Yeah, let's do VI then.
Okay.
The nation shall apply preventative and restrictive measures on activities that might lead to the, we read that one, to the extinction of species and destruction of ecosystems.
Yes.
Let's go to VII.
Okay.
VIII.
We already read that one.
No, we didn't.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, we read VII. Yeah, so read VIII and we're going to be done.
Okay. Last one on the page. All
Yeah.
right. Environmental services shall not be subject to.
No, now you skipped one again. VIII.
There's two VII.
We did?
We did read that one.
Okay.
Last one still?
Whatever you want.
Okay, choose the
I'm
last
done.
two anyways. All right, so second to last, penultimate. Persons, communities, and people shall have the right to benefit from the environment and the natural wealth, enabling them to enjoy the good way of living. Other, one, environmental services shall not be subject to appropriation. The production, delivery, use, and development shall be regulated by the nation.
When's the workshop on Roman numerals?
I'm not leading that one. So just with the last few minutes that we have left, we wanted to talk about next steps. So I'm just curious, just as a very initial, you're not making any commitment at all, but raise your hand if you think that you might be interested in becoming part of an Athens community rights group to explore a campaign of this sort for Athens. And Carla and Susie, are you seeing hands? Just to give a sense. That's pretty impressive. That's like 2/3 or at least half or 2/3 of the people who are here. And so the first step would be, I think, Carla and Susie and Eva sending out an announcement to everybody who came and saying, we're going to have an initial meeting or two and start telling you what we're up to. Do you want to say anything more than that?
Nope. I can't really.
First meeting at Henderson's.
Yeah.
That is the place.
I'll be emailing everyone who, just please make sure you put your email address on that list, on the same list that says Community Rights US, because we're sharing it.
We're sharing the list.
We're sharing it.
And
so,
everyone will hear about the initial meeting.
Yeah.
So, where's your
Contract.
oh yeah, sorry, wait, get that one too, that piece too about the library donation.
Oh, yeah, if you still wanted to donate
oh,
to
that never went around.
Yeah.
But they can
You
get
can donate.
Yeah, please. Well, let's send it around.
like a jar, glass jar, if you want to donate, to help us.
Not how you get donations.
A small jar.
Anyways, and sorry, Susie, what was
Throw
your
in
second?
$1, throw in 2, throw in 5.
Susie, was that
So
the
that we can
announcement?
have 8 or
I was
10
gonna
books
say
for
that,
reference here.
The first ever Rights of Nature Symposium is being hosted this Friday at Tulane University in New Orleans. It's really exciting. Actually, Carla and I are going with Paul, are leaving tomorrow, and two other students from UGA are also attending. And it's just kind of a testament to, I guess, how much it's expanded. In fact, they're having their first symposium
In the country on rights of nature.
Yeah, there's going to be a
It's an
lot
international
of
conference.
International.
people from New Zealand, Ecuador, because New Zealand, there's been several nations at this point who have
Yeah.
passed rights of nature laws in their national constitution, which is pretty amazing. And so there's going to be leaders from those countries at the first U.S. Rights of Nature Symposium in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And they have, so this is, the information on this is on the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which, yeah, Paul mentioned is a mouthful, but that's the public interest law firm that initially started helping these communities in rural Pennsylvania, and since then have helped, nations pass rights of nature laws. So, yeah, if you want more information on that, you can just let me know and I'll send you to the right direction. Yeah.
And when you're thinking about making a contribution in the jar, this workshop frequently costs $5, $10, $20, $30 to attend, and you're getting it for free. So that means that's even a better reason for you to throw a few dollars in the jar. And then you end up with a book collection in your community that you can borrow and use as a reference for this entire movement. Have all the key books right here in the community.
Yeah,
So-
and I'll in whatever email I send you, I will decide on location, how to access our
That's right.
referential library.
Past Carla's locked front door.
Yeah.
So we haven't, you've been I'm not used to a group being as quiet as you all have been.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Okay, one more thing. So as a project organization, whatever you want to call us, we also want to support other initiatives in the community because I know a lot of good work is being done. And actually, regarding rivers, there's an Upper Oconee Water Trails board that just recently formed. How long ago was that?
Oh, people have been talking about it for 20 years.
For 20 years.
Wow.
Trying to establish an official water trail from the Athens area down to Lake Oconee.
Amazing, and it's just finally been.
We have one launch site in Athens at Binberg Park.
Okay.
We're looking for a partner for that. That's on the middle of Oconee. We're looking on the north of Oconee as well.
Cool.
So if you are part of an organization and you want to bring anything like a flyer or something, you know, that would help get the word out about what you're doing, especially like with river, we have a lot of river organizations in Athens, and so it's like perfect. We're able to kind of spread the word, make sure we're all aware of what's going on. So yeah, feel free to. We'd love to, you know, support.
Yeah, we're not an exclusive organization. We're all supporting, you know, everybody else who's kind of, you know, sharing sort of the paradigm shift that we would like to start making happen here.
And just kind of increasing more, you know, community interaction, and so we know what's going on. Because sometimes, like, people can be, you know, I mean, I don't have a lot of experience in community organizing, but it would seem like it's pretty easy to put, to get kind of blindsided by what you're doing, and then kind of like even something so relevant such as something development on the river to help kind of raise awareness of it. It's like it's great to be aware of those things, and really kind of makes the community look better. So just want to make sure people know that.
And I forgot to say that anybody who gives us their email address, I will send you sometime in the next 4 or 5 days a resource list of additional easy free stuff that you can access online about community rights history and strategy. What that will include a link to that amazing timeline that's on the table, so that you can have direct access to the timeline. Yeah. Any other comments or questions in our closing minutes?
Just my question. Have you guys faced any litigation yet? Has anybody sued at all?
Yeah, that 5% of the 200 communities, have I not even said this? Wow. So 95% of the 200 communities were not legally challenged. So about 190 stopped the corporate proposal before it ever came. That's an amazing success rate. That's really unparalleled in U.S. environmental, policy. And then the other approximately 10 communities, 5% of the 200, most of them were in situations where the local government freaked out about being sued and took it off the books, which is not what we want them to do, right? We want to build a resistance movement of communities that get it, that that's part of the risk in taking on these structures of law. The most interesting lawsuit that is moving forward, where the local township supervisors have incredible backbone, is Grant Township, Pennsylvania. And that's the legal brief that's in the back. And they're also the very first ones to put into their ordinance nonviolent direct action as enforcement, as a legal form of local enforcement. And that is working its way through litigation in the courts. But it's a township in rural Pennsylvania that is trying to stop an energy company from dumping toxic wastewater from fracking operations into drilled holes in the ground a half a mile from the public water supply in their township. And these people are adamant that is not going to happen in their township. So even if they lose the court case, they're not going to let it happen. And that's what's so interesting about this work, is we don't sit on our hands when a judge says, I'm sorry, you can't do that. We say to the judge, excuse me, but that decision is a violation of our right to protect your health and welfare. So it's really, we're not looking for judicial wins, we will get them sooner or later as the structures of law are finally changed. And we'll get individual judges who are brave enough along the way to say, we're going to take on so-called settled law. And in fact, if I can find it real quick, I can read you the first judge in the United States to actually begin the crack is a female judge. Shouldn't be a surprise there. In Pennsylvania, in Washington County, in a local court in Pennsylvania, who was hearing a case around harm against a family that had been paid off by a fracking corporation because they'd lost their water supply from their well. It's kind of a long story to describe. I'm not going to describe it, but she ended up citing against the corporation. And let me just read you a small excerpt from her decision against the corporation, which is very rare at this point early in our work. She said, "It is axiomatic that corporations, companies, and partnerships have no spiritual nature, no feelings, intellect, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, or sensations." That's what I was talking about earlier, that corporations are not beings, right? They're legal fiction. They don't exist because they do not exist in the manner that humankind exists, she says. Corporations cannot be let alone by government because businesses are but grapes, ripe upon the vine of the law, that the people of this commonwealth raise, tend, and prune at their pleasure and need. In other words, corporations are ours to define. They are ours to create. They don't stand separate with all sorts of independent rights. And then she ruled against the business corporation and in favor of the family whose water had been poisoned. That's the first crack in the judicial armor. And it'll be many years before we see enough cracks that the thing just cracks right open. And that's why we, the people, have to be standing firm together and saying, regardless of what the justices say, we're defending our authority and our right where we live to stop corporate harm in our communities, not just to say, well, 10 parts per million of mercury in the river is just going to have to be good enough because that's what the regulators say, right? So any last thoughts or questions? All right. It's an evening. Thank you very much.